Hello friends and welcome back to House of Props. As you know, I'm a sucker for this little guy and Target had him on clearance for only $8, so naturally I had to bring him home with me. He is the version from Mattel that when you squeeze him, he makes noise, closes his eyes, and raises his hand to use the force. I didn't want to have him just sitting all loose and alone, so I decided to make a custom display for him. But the question was what to make. I've already made a pram, in fact that's the way I started out this channel, and last year I made a life-size IG-12, so I wanted something a little different. That's when I got the idea to incorporate a Sorgan frog, since they were his favorite snack and they became his plaything at the end of Season 3. But for the display, I wanted to have Grogu use the force on the frog and not be swallowing it. As inspiration, I used this scene in the 7th episode of the Book of Boba Fett, or as I like to refer to it as, The Mandalorian Season 2.1. The reason for using this scene was simply because the colors of the frog and the surrounding vegetation are warm and inviting, indicating a tranquil space. So I decided to try and capture that exact moment when the frog is about to jump in the water, but Grogu keeps him aloft. For this display, I'll show you techniques I've used in my professional theater work like resin and texturing that are perfect for home display pieces as well. So let's get started. I begin by creating the structure with two 12-inch diameter circles cut out of 3/4-inch plywood. One will be the base of the display, and the second I will cut in half along a very organic line. And to cut these, you can easily just use a bandsaw or a jigsaw. To elevate this funky shaped piece, I'm gluing some 1-inch wide strips of plywood down with some wood glue. Then apply the wood glue to the top of the strips and align the top piece like so. Then everything is clamped tight so nothing moves or shifts as it dries. When the wood glue was dry, I could remove the clamps and begin to build up the rock structure. To do that, I'm using XPS foam. It's relatively cheap from home improvement stores, you could get a large amount for the cost, and it's easy to work with. I cut a piece that matches the top wood piece and indicate where I will have Grogu sit because I'm going to build up the foam so it supports the figure and keeps it from toppling over. To attach the foam, I'm not using anything fancy, I'm just using CA glue, also known as super glue. While I do that, I would really appreciate it if you would click the subscribe button if you haven't already. It's completely free to you and will only help this channel grow. Plus, if you click the notification bell, you can receive notifications when a new project is released. Thank you! The foam can be aligned onto the wood and clamped into place, so this initial layer of CA glue will dry before we attach more foam. To build up the rock shape, I rough cut and attach scraps of the foam. This foam is really easy to slice with a hobby knife or a utility knife, which makes cutting a lot easier. And it doesn't make nearly as much mess as a saw would. You can add layers of the foam on top of each other to create any shape you want. So this is how mine looked with all the foam in place. I even added scraps in between the plywood around the outer edges, so the texture will have something to hold on to. To sculpt the foam into more of a rock shape, I take a hot wire cutter and carve away the knife edges to create a more natural, organic look. This is the point where you can create a really nice shape in the rock. This does create toxic fumes, so while you work, make sure you wear your PPE and work in a highly ventilated area. Now, with the general shape carved, the foam can start to receive texturing. To create the first layer, I took some white glue, thinned it with water, and tear up some newsprint into manageable shapes. These are then dipped into the glue and pressed onto the foam with a brush. You have to really saturate the paper with the glue and water and work it into all the foam texture in order for it to stick properly. This process can be messy, which is why I laid down a tarp on my workstation. Then piece after piece can be applied to the foam, and the more glue, the better. After it's dry, we're left with this hard shell over the foam, and we're starting to get something that resembles a rock. There are a couple of damp spots, but it'll be safe to continue since they're not super wet. Now to apply more texture, I'm using some latex caulk. I'm using this kind because it's really affordable and there's more than enough in this tube for a project like this. In fact, there'll be a lot left over. I just generously apply the caulks to the paper-covered foam with a palette knife, and one of the great things about a project like this is it doesn't need to be an even coat. In fact, it's better to keep the coverage sporadic and random. Then an old paintbrush can be pounced into the caulk to give it a more porous texture like rock and not look like a badly iced cake. This step will also help hide the marks left behind by the palette knife. I let the caulk dry overnight and the next day it was ready to paint. The rock was based with a dark charcoal gray, and as you can see, I didn't apply any texture to the spot for the figure because 1, it won't be seen, and 2, I want the figure to sit flat in the opening, but this area will still be painted. And as you paint, make sure to really work the paint into all the textures so you don't see any bare spots when it dries. I continued some of the gray down onto the wood, and while the gray was drying, I based the top of the exposed wood with a brown. This area is where the resin will be poured, but before that, we want to create a muddy pond bottom look. While the brown is still drying, I work in some green earth tones that have been thinned with a lot of water. The reason for this is the paint will be visible through the resin, and this will just add to the illusion of a pond bottom made of mud and algae. I also used the same greens to add moss onto the rock texture, especially around the base where the rock would be the most damp. Then a clay gray, which is a gray with a warm hue to it, can be dry brushed onto the rock texture. It wants to really catch the texture, but not so much the recessed areas. Then a light gray can be brushed very subtly over the high points of the rock. This will just add a little bit of highlight, and it really just wants to catch that texture. After those grays have dried, I take some black paint and thin it with some water to create a deep black wash. This can then be brushed onto spots of the rock where you want to create shadow areas, and then simply blended by dabbing with a paper towel. In order for the rock to not look so black and white, I made a wash with the brown and applied it in the same manner as the black, but to spots other than where the black was applied. This will just add more dimension to the rock and make it look more natural. Next, I took some dried grass and glued it into spots on the rock and where the resin will be poured so it'll look like it's sticking up out of the water. Then used some of the green paint to add some variation to it. If you don't want to use grass, you could use a synthetic or even make it out of paper. At this point, I needed the frog, so I just went out into the yard and grabbed one that was hopping around. Just kidding. To make the frog, I sculpted the body out of some Sculpey clay, which is great for a project like this because it'll stay soft until you bake it. So I don't use as much clay. I'm going to build the bulk of the body out of aluminum foil, or if you're in the UK, aluminium foil. I just compress the foil until I'm left with this basic shape, which will be the main body of the frog. Now, the clay is a little firm when it first comes out of the package, but if you knead it and work with it a little bit, it'll soften up. Then I roll out a slab that's about 1/4 inch thick and then wrap this around the foil base. By keeping the clay thin, it not only uses less clay, but it takes less time to bake. While wrapping the clay, I also blend out any seams or gaps that may be visible. Next, I added the ridges on the back. These are thinly rolled clay sausages that can be pressed and blended onto the main body with some silicone sculpting tools. Then using my fingers, the ridges can be really incorporated into the unit. Next, I created a divot where the eye goes and rolled some clay into a ball and pressed this into the socket and blended with the sculpting tools. Then small little sausages can be added around the ball to create the eyelids. Then I create a slit for the mouth and blend it to make the lips. Then thick stubby tubes were added to create the front legs. After the toes were added, this was how the frog was looking so far, and I was happy with it, so all that was needed were the rear legs. To make these, I wrapped clay around some wire, stuck the wire into the body, and blended the legs onto the body. At this point, he was ready to go into an old convection oven and bake. This clay says to bake at 275 for 15 minutes for every 1/4 inch of thickness, so I'm going to leave him in for 20 just to be safe. When the 20 were up and he cooled, he was hard as a rock. There was a slight crack on one leg, but that's no big deal. That can easily be fixed. To even out some fingerprints and lines I wasn't happy with though, I gave him a light sanding with some 120 grit sandpaper. While sanding, I realized I really wasn't happy with the sculpt. It wasn't dynamic enough, so I broke off his back legs and one front leg, repositioned them, glued them in place, filled the cracks with a thin smear of clay, and put him back in the oven for another 5 minutes. And this I'm happy with. It has more energy of movement and doesn't look as static. To seal the clay so it'll receive paint better, I spray the frog with Plasti-Dip. This way it'll seal and protect the clay, but it also has some flex to it, so it's less likely to crack and split like a spray primer could potentially do. Once that Plasti had dried, I based the frog in a moss green. This green is a light green that has a little yellow in it. While applying the paint, I dabbed the surface to create a texture effect with the paint that will resemble frog skin. When that has dried, I use my airbrush and spray the frog with a brownish green. Quick tip about airbrushing. You can use regular acrylic paints thinned with rubbing alcohol and they work just as well as the store-bought airbrush paints. Plus, the rubbing alcohol dries quickly, so you're less likely to get runs in your paint job. When spraying this layer, I did spray the frog all over, but in some spots I went heavier than others. That way the original green will show through and it'll leave a more dynamic paint job. Next, I mixed the light green and airbrushed the frog's belly and the back of both sets of legs. Using the same color, I added a couple of spots on the body of the frog, as well as some stripes down the back set of legs. Then I switched to a dark forest green and spray in the center of the white spots, leaving a little bit of the white showing around the edges, and I do the same thing to the stripes on the legs, but not on the light area on the belly. I ended up applying 2 coats of this dark green overall to make these markings more prominent. Then using a small 00 brush, I take the light green and add some wiggly lines around the dark spots and the stripes. These can be very sporadic with openings and breaks in the lines. So that's the frog painted, and to add some shine like what frogs have, I sealed the paint job with a light spray of gloss clear coat. This will seal the paint job from scratches and add a little wetness to the look. At this point the painting was finished and I could figure out the placement for the frog. Once I had an idea for where I wanted it, I could attach the levitating device to the base. I'm using a clear glass straw I was able to purchase locally. I cut it down to the correct height, but I'm keeping and using the bent top piece. You could use an acrylic tube if you have access to one as well. Then I use a spade bit on my drill to carve out a hole for the straw to sit in on the base. I paint the raw exposed wood to match the pond bottom, and then apply CA glue to the hole before pressing the straw in. This next part I'm a little pissed about actually. I thought I had clicked the button to record when I was mixing and pouring the resin, just to find out it didn't record. But anyway, for this I'm using a clear casting resin that mixes in a 1:1 ratio, which I've tinted slightly with some acrylic paint. Oh, I also hot glued a temporary wall around the outside edge so the resin won't run off the base. It was then poured into the well, and this resin takes about 12 hours to cure, so I was able to let it sit for about 10 minutes so the air bubbles come to the surface, and then using a lighter, lightly waft over the bubbles to pop them, and you end up with a glass-like surface. Once the wall was peeled away after the resin cured, I wet sanded the vertical edge with some 1000 grit sandpaper. This will polish up the sides so it'll be just as clear as the surface when we're finished. You can see that the side still appears to be cloudy, but if sprayed with the gloss clear coat, it will magically become clear. Almost finished. The last paint step was to paint the wood base with some black acrylic. I applied 2 coats because the raw wood absorbed some of the first, leaving it looking a little uneven, so the second evened everything out. Now it was time to attach the frog. I very carefully carved out a hole with the spade bit and glued the frog onto the support rod using CA glue. To help hide the support rod, I added a little more of the dried grass on top of the resin with CA glue. And with that, Grogu could be put in place and the display was complete. Now, I just need to find space for it. It is a custom build, but the techniques shown can be used across a multitude of projects and displays. I hope you liked this video and found some useful information within. Please give it a thumbs up. If you have any comments or questions, type them below and I'll respond. Share this video with friends and family and subscribe to my channel, and I'll catch you on the next one. Have a great day. And remember, if you are building any of my builds or using any of my templates, feel free and tag me at House of Props on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok, because I would really like to see your fantastic work. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.